Bill, what do you think the biggest muscle building mistake people make, even if they're experienced lifters?
I'm going to make it a mental mistake, and it's having unrealistic expectations.
What do you mean by that?
I think what they'll see is in my day, the magazines or social media transformations, which may or may not be true, or even this is where I come in, reading research where all of the studies are publishing subjects are gaining 4 pounds of 7 pounds of lean mass in 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, failing to realize these subjects are always young, not really trained, and since they're in a research study, probably have everything dialed in. They're being watched. We know that if a study is supervised, you get significantly greater outcomes than when it's just you lifting on your own. So even the research that I publish and that I've contributed to, it is giving some false expectations for people who aren't in the research studies. So that's the first thing that came to my mind. It's not that they're doing it wrong. It's just that they have a wrong impression of what is possible to build or what is likely possible to build in a short term.
Yeah, unrealistic expectations coupled with instant gratification, the want for instant gratification, right? Which we know is important for staying on track, is to like see some sort of change or results. With that said, if somebody's listening to this or watching this and they want to see a dramatic change in their body, they want to appear more muscular, and they're committed to starting a program, what are some healthy expectations they should set around that?
Well, one, I would always say, let's make sure that we're pulling the low hanging fruit. So what is that? Well, it's being consistent with your resistance exercise program. So let's start there. What is your plan? Execute that plan. I would rather you have a crappy program that you actually don't skip workouts than the perfect plan that you don't often go to. So one, consistency of the anabolic stimulus. And that's how I view resistance exercise. That is the stimulus to your body to induce a muscle adaptation. So then the thing that we have to pair that with would be two things, but I'll start with the best: protein. So optimize protein intake. So resistance exercise is the stimulus for growth. The protein is the adaptive nutrient. That's the nutrient that allows you to adapt to that stimulus. And now I'm going to pick on all of my female friends for a moment and also say calories matter. Don't be in a perpetual diet. If you tell me your goal is to build muscle and you're in and out of diets all the time, and I say females because in my career, that is what I have seen more often, much more often in the female population than the male population. So if the goal is to build muscle, don't be in a diet. So I always like to say dieting is not your friend if your goal is to build muscle.
Yeah. And I've had different exercise scientists on the show, Dr. Mike Israetel, Andy Galpin, to talk about optimal programming for resistance training. And I feel like somehow everybody kind of comes back to the same thing. But I would love to hear your stance based on research. Like, what is the optimal program design for somebody who's looking to build as much muscle mass as they can?
So I love being a science communicator. So I've broken this down into an easy to remember acronym. So the acronym is called LEAF, LEAF. If you can spell LEAF, you can design your own program. So let's talk through them. And if what we'll do, unless you tell me otherwise, I'll say one, I'll talk about it, and then you can stop before I go to the next one. So the first one is load. Some people will call that intensity, but load is just how much weight are you lifting? Should I lift with heavy weights all the time? Can I lift with light weights? What about medium weights? So effectively, load is when you go to the weight room, you're going to choose a weight for whatever exercise. You're going to bench press. You're going to have to choose a weight to put on that bar. And we'll assume after your warm up. If you lift with heavy weights, that is great. That is the best thing to maximize strength. So if your goal is to maximize strength, you have to lift with heavy weights. If your goal is to maximize muscle hypertrophy or muscle growth, heavy weights are awesome, but you don't have to. You can build just as much muscle with heavy weights as you can with light weights. Now, if you choose light weights, there is a prerequisite, and that prerequisite is you have to train to failure or near failure to get to optimize the hypertrophic response. So I'll back up 1 second. There's two main theories as to what causes a muscle to grow. The one that everybody agrees with is called mechanical tension. So how much tension is being placed on these muscle fibers? Heavy weights will maximize that. The other is metabolic stress. And I think of that as basically you're limiting the amount of oxygen that can go into a skeletal muscle during a set. So if you're doing light weights for rep after rep after rep, you keep contracting the muscle, which also constricts the blood vessels feeding the muscle, and that thereby limiting the amount of oxygen. So low weights really emphasizes the metabolic stress side of this equation. Heavy weights maximizes the mechanical tension side of this equation. So I take all of this into consideration relative to load, and my advice is a suggestion to lift with moderate weights most of the time. And what does that mean? That means choose a weight that you can lift approximately 6 to 12 repetitions most of the time. It's heavy enough that you're getting mechanical tension, and it's light enough that you're getting some metabolic stress. And one last statement on load. I think the best program will have days and times where you're lifting heavier weights, less than 5 reps. And there'll be some days where you have lighter weights, allowing you to do between 15 and 20 repetitions. But most of the time, between 6 and 12 repetitions, choose a weight that allows you to hit that. So there's the L part.
Quick question around that. I feel like we've heard a lot about training until near failure, but I think that sometimes people don't really know what that's like. Like, how can somebody practice training until near failure so they can understand what that actually feels like?
So I recommend using what I call a test day. So maybe like once every 2 months, choose a weight, and depending on the lift, have a partner if you're bench pressing, and you lift that weight until you cannot lift it again, until somebody has to pull that bar off of you, or if it's dumbbells, until you cannot physically do another repetition. Let's just say it's dumbbell shoulder presses, and I'm going to pull out 40-pound dumbbells for myself. My goal is I'm going to lift them on my test day, 40 pounds, until I can't do another rep. So let's pretend I got 14 reps with 40 pounds. Now I know the next time I go to the gym, and probably for the next several weeks, if I'm using 40 pounds and I'm not getting 12 or 13 reps, at least on that first set, then I'm not going close to failure. If I'm constantly stopping at 10. So that's kind of like an auto-regulated approach where I'm using my own body and using specific weights, and I'm actually testing what my failure is. And then that calibrates me for the next several weeks or several months in that lift.
And so I'm guessing the E is exercise.
No. So E is effort, what some people will refer to as intensity. So now we know we want to choose relatively heavy weights, and this has to do with how close to failure do we go. Again, most people will call it intensity. It didn't fit my acronym, so I call it effort because it fits into LEAF better. So when we choose our weight, how close to failure, what is the effort that we need to do on these sets? So not counting warm-up sets, and you already mentioned it, the general rule is you need to take every set to near failure. You could even take it to failure. And again, I say take it to failure on test days occasionally. But if you don't go to near failure, you are not maximizing the anabolic stimulus on that muscle group on that set. So, but if you go to near failure, and I'll define that as approximately 2 or less repetitions to where you cannot physically lift that weight for another rep. If you do that, you are maximizing the anabolic stimulus on that muscle for that set. And research has shown there is no advantage to going to absolute, or what some people would call technical failure. You get the same anabolic effect if you stop a rep or two short. And if you're an athlete, if performance is important to you, or if you're a trainer to your clients, training to failure actually works against them, because it has been shown to reduce acute and, more importantly, chronic power output. And that makes sense, because when you go to failure, you really are training your neuromuscular system to train slowly towards the end of those sets. Now, one more thing here. I do train to failure because I'm trying to make my workout shorter. I don't have to, I'm not dodging linebackers, so I'm not playing a sport. So I'm training to failure in my own workouts, knowing it's not giving me a hypertrophic advantage, but I feel like it's giving me a greater workout in a shorter period of time.
Right. And so I guess moving on to the A, now that we kind of already covered failure twice, about what that's like.
That's important.
It is. So what's the A?
The A is amount, which most people are going to call volume. So how many sets do I do? How often do I hit a muscle group? So this is where I think it's important for me to conceptualize how I conceptualize a workout or a program. So I look at this more as a bodybuilder. So I look at the body as broken up into body parts or muscle groups. So I'm sculpting the body. Now, if I were a power lifter, for an example, I wouldn't look at muscle groups. I would look at exercises: squat, bench press, deadlift. Or if I'm an athlete, I'm not looking at body parts. I could care less how an athlete trains their biceps, unless they're a dart thrower or something. So an athlete, I would be training movement patterns. So I want to make sure that I get this context. So if I'm looking at the body in terms of body parts, then what we ask is, how often should I train each muscle group or body part? So think of it as like biceps, triceps, shoulders, chest, back, quads, hamstrings, glutes. Those are all body parts or muscle groups. And when we ask the question about amount or volume of training, what most scientists do, and I think this is what most coaches in practice do, they count the number of working sets. So we're not counting warm-up sets. How many sets do you do for a muscle group over a 7-day period? And what I'm about to say is, I'm pretty confident that we have a consensus on these volume categories. So if you're training a muscle group for less than 10 sets per week, so let's just say I'm doing, 4 sets of bench press, 3 sets of dumbbell presses, and 3 sets of cable flies. 4 plus 3 plus 3, that's 10 sets on my chest. If I did that Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 4 sets, 3 sets, 3 sets, that's 10 sets per week. Most researchers would suggest 10 or less sets per week is considered low volume. Moderate volume is around 11 to 20 or 11 to 19 sets per week per body part. And then once you get over 20 sets per week, we would consider that high volume. And I'll give a little context to that. When you look at the research literature about competitive bodybuilders, what they will typically do in terms of volume for each muscle group is over 20 sets per week, so 22 to 24 sets per week. So that gives a context for, wow, so a bodybuilder spending 2 hours, 2.5 hours maybe in the gym. Yeah, well, if you're going to do 20 plus sets for chest and back and quads and hamstrings and calves, by the way, I hate training calves. That's what that looks like. So the amount, I would never tell somebody do 15 sets. I always base your volume or the amount. What were you doing prior? So if you're coming to me for advice, first thing I need to know is what have you been doing? Or if you're a beginner, okay, you've been doing nothing. The worst thing I think I could do is say, hey, let's put you on a moderate program here, because as a trainer, you will put that person in a state where they will never want to train again. That they won't be able to move. They'll be sore. So to me, volume or the amount of training under this description is based on what you've been doing. And if the goal is to build muscle, small incremental changes over time. And then I personally like to cycle that. So you keep increasing the volume and then you kind of reset it and you go back to the beginning. That beginning goes a little higher and then you cycle again and you go back to the beginning.
And so what do you recommend for the person who's like the average lifter? Like what would their like sets be versus somebody who's like, I want to look like a bodybuilder, and not without taking anabolic steroids? Like how would you what would you recommend sets wise for each of those two people?
So let's say for an average person first, the first thing I would do is say, what is your schedule? How many days a week can you go to the gym and lift weights? If I get that number, now I'm going to reverse engineer the best program for that person. So if they said I could go 4 days per week, then I'm going to throw on the table some options. 4 days per week. Okay. So that could be an upper day, a lower day, and an upper day and a lower day. So we're hitting upper, lower twice. It could be 4 whole body workouts. And probably the volume would fall somewhere between 10 and 18 sets per body part for this type of person. But if somebody says they're a bodybuilder, well, the research, the way that I interpret the research is that more volume is better, but you got to be careful with that, because if you keep increasing volume and you were to do that over 4 or 5 years, you get to the point where you're lifting 7 hours a day. So you got to be careful about how you titrate volume. But if you say, my number one goal is to be a bodybuilder and build as much muscle mass as I can. Well, what we've already talked about, we know what the research says. They're doing on average 20 plus sets per body part. So I think we would develop a plan that would get them to that type of volume, but also monitor their progress. Is it too much? Is it not enough? But those two people, the number one difference is going to be the time commitment in the gym.
So is there such thing as junk volume? I mean, I've heard people talk about like once you do above a certain amount of sets per week, you're essentially just wasting your time.
I can't point to a study that says, yep, here's evidence of junk volume. What I can let me just say intuitively, it makes sense. If I do 25 sets of bench presses, am I getting an added anabolic stimulus on those 25 sets than if I had done 4? And I don't think you are. So the question is, where does the plateau start to come in as I keep doing an additional set? What I imagine is you keep increasing the muscle protein synthesis response keeps increasing until a certain point. And I can't point to a specific study, but I'm going to vaguely remember what I have read on this. And I think that's around 3 to 5 sets, somewhere in that sweet spot. We're going above 3 to 5 sets on an exercise. There is diminishing returns such that after 5 sets, 3 to 5 sets, we'll say, you're not getting any added value. You are increasing the fatigue stimulus. So now you're going to have to recover longer, but you're not getting the anabolic response to that stimulus. So I do think there is such a thing as junk volume. It makes sense to me. And I am relying on this acute research where you keep adding sets, but you don't have an added muscle protein synthetic response.
Yeah, because I feel like sometimes people, the pushback on the 10 sets per week, 15 sets per week, well, it's like, well, that's not enough. Like, how do I know I'm going to be like hitting the muscle enough? And I think that's because they follow some of these bodybuilding programs where they see them, it's like back and you're doing like 20 sets of back and then shoulders, 20 sets. But if your goal isn't to be a bodybuilder, then you really don't need as much volume is what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah, and 2 thoughts on that. One's an experience, another's a thought. A lot of this, if it's coming from like our icons in the sport, well, they're enhanced athletes in many cases. So that's a different population as well. So if you're enhanced, you're going to be able to tolerate a lot more volume. The other thing, and this makes me laugh because historically I would do a lot of powerlifting studies or bodybuilding studies in my lab, and they would be average studies. And the number of times I had young men that, I guess I can call them kids now, that's not enough. I have to, we got to do more than that. But I would convince them to do the study, or they would be, hey, we're going to give you all these tests. We're going to give you free protein. Many times the subjects who said that's not enough, they kept missing workouts. It wasn't like they were out doing their own thing. They couldn't even stick to what they said was not enough. So I think what happens is in their head, they're like, I do more than that. And they probably do more than that when they show up. But when you have a study, when we have, people there monitoring, are you there? Are you doing each set to near failure? That's a difference. That's reality versus what you have in your head. So I always laugh at that because I've seen it a lot in my career. The young men, the young guys, that's not enough, are the ones who can't do it for 8 weeks.
Right. It definitely takes some time to build real muscle mass. What's the F in LEAF?
Frequency. So everybody, I don't have to give another name for that. So we talked about the volume of training. So 20 sets. Well, do you do all 20 sets one day? Let's just say we're going to do 20 sets. Do you do all 20 sets in 1 day per week? So that would be a frequency of 1. And we look at frequency or define frequency over a 7-day period. And again, that's arbitrary, I guess, but that's what most people do. And the research on this, and I'm relying on approximately 10 human studies, almost all of these are in males, is as long as the volume is equated, so as long as you're doing 20 sets over the week, it really doesn't matter how frequently you hit the muscle groups, with one exception. We do have, and I'm aware of 2 studies that have reported that 1 day per week is not optimal. So if I were to do all 20 sets of, let's say, triceps in 1 day, that is not as good as if I would divide it to 2 times or more per week. But when you ask the question, well, is 4 better than 2? Is 3 better than 6? It seems like it's equivocal. As long as volume is the same, 3 is as good as 5, 4 is as good as 2. But limited research has suggested that we don't want to put all of the volume on 1 day, even though, we call those bro splits. And not that you won't grow with that. It's just that the studies that I've read, that is not optimal for muscle hypertrophy outcomes, at least not in the short term.
And I guess the way to find out if you're not lifting heavy enough, if you're not like lifting enough volume, et cetera, is that you're just not building muscle, you're not getting stronger, right?
Yeah. Yep. That's exactly right. And again, you can use test days. Now, strength tends to go up a little more consistently than muscle mass. Muscle mass is a slower process.
I think one of the main goals, or a big goal, I should say, when people are looking to build muscle is they're also trying to do like a body recomp and build muscle and burn fat. You're also, you're a fat loss scientist as well. You study fat loss. Do you think this is actually possible? We'll get you back to this episode in just 1 second, but first I want to give a quick shout out to this episode's sponsor, Fresh Pressed Olive Oil Club. Like many of us, I'm eating healthier, and that's why I love good olive oil. And by good, I mean fresh. Olive oil packs the most flavor and healthiest nutrients when it's fresh from the farm. And that's the problem with supermarket olive oils. They're just not that fresh. They can sit on the shelf for many months and grow stale. That's why I get my olive oil direct from small, award-winning farms, thanks to my buddy, TJ Robinson, who's also known as the olive oil hunter, who you may have heard recently on the podcast. When I tasted TJ's farm fresh oils, I fell in love with their vibrant, grassy flavors. They're incredibly delicious on things like salad, veggies, pasta, meat, fish, you name it. As an introduction to his Fresh Press Olive Oil Club, TJ is willing to send you a full-size $39 bottle of one of the world's finest olive oils, fresh from the new harvest, for just $1 to help him cover shipping. And there's no commitment to buy anything now or ever. Get your free $39 bottle for just $1 shipping and taste the difference freshness makes. Go to getfreshdoug.com. That's getfreshdoug.com for a free bottle and just pay $1 for shipping. That's getfreshdoug.com. Now back to the show.
It's 100% possible. We have way too many publications, research reports, like validating this, reporting, hey, the subjects in this study, on average, they gained muscle and lost fat. Now, while it's possible, and while I can point to study after study after study, it is still the exception to the rule. I would never take on a client and say, hey, this is my body recomposition plan. It can happen. It does happen. We have evidence of it, but it is not expected, and it is the exception, not the rule. And I used to think, well, that would only happen in like newbies. And clearly you have a better chance to do that when you just start lifting. But we also do see it in people that, at least in this research literature, that have claimed to have been lifting for 6 months, a year, 2+ years. So it can even happen in advanced clients as well. So not impossible, but it is the exception, not the rule.
What do you think has to happen in order for that to be possible for somebody?
Two things. So one, the consistent resistance exercise stimulus, and then optimal protein intake. So protein drives this quite a bit. So trying to think of the studies that I'm just remembering now. Again, much more of the evidence is in newly resistance trained subjects rather than advanced. But even in advanced, we see this. And it's typically, even in the advanced, it's pairing a adequate volume program with optimal protein intakes. And what does optimal look like? That's typically a range of 0.75 to 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight.
There's people that will say you have to be in like a caloric deficit as well. So you're saying are you saying that they also have to be in a caloric deficit while keeping protein high and resistance training for this to happen?
Well, the research would suggest you don't have to be in a caloric deficit. You could be in a caloric deficit, but by virtue of training more, if you are increasing your training, that is creating de facto a negative energy balance. So you could say it's a caloric deficit. So even if you're keeping your food the same, if you're increasing the volume of your training or even the intensity, you are burning more calories. And again, by default, you're in a negative energy balance. Most of the studies I'm relying on did not put subjects in a caloric deficit. It's hard to build muscle in a caloric deficit. From the cellular level to the tissue level, dieting or being in a caloric deficit works against your body's ability to build muscle. Can it happen? Yes, we have evidence of it. But again, it's the exception, not the rule.
I've heard that you have learned from a lot from like bodybuilders and then applied that in a realistic setting. Like, what's been your biggest takeaway from bodybuilders as to how they train, how they eat, and how have you applied that to help the everyday person?
Yeah, so the way that I describe this is I look at bodybuilders as like the fat loss experts, the ones who know how to lose fat, the ones who know how to build the most muscle. And effectively what I've built my research career on is learning from them and then dialing back their strategies such that people like myself or my wife who want to look like a bodybuilder but don't actually want to step on stage, what are the things we can do to make what they do more sustainable to give us essentially a bodybuilding lifestyle? So I think some of the things I've learned is you don't need to do all of the volume to build a great physique. You don't have to be in the gym for 2 hours, even though many bodybuilders are, but you don't have to do that. Protein is so important in optimizing your physiques. Very important. So just consistently hitting this protein intake, this optimal protein range day after day after day. And something I think I've learned over my career, or definitely an area where I've changed my mind, is just the aspect of cardio. So I thought for a long time, if you do cardio, that kind of eats away at your muscle. You're not going to build much muscle. And then I did a deep dive on this a few years ago, and for a course I was working on, and the research does not say that at all. In fact, there is more research reporting if you add cardio to your resistance training, you actually gain muscle than losing it. And that research, by the way, is in muscle biopsy methodology and MRI, which is the gold standard of assessing muscle hypertrophy. Now, the one caveat here is if we think of our Olympia level bodybuilders, so these men who have massive amounts of muscle, there's no research in them. Is it possible if they added cardio that they would lose muscle mass? That's possible. We also do know that a high volume of cardio does work against your maximal strength goals. So muscle hypertrophy doesn't seem to matter at all for normal people. If your goal is to compete in a powerlifting competition and you signed up for a marathon, that's not a good idea.
Right. I had Phil Heath on the podcast, and he's won, 7 Olympias and is, I guess seen by many as one of the GOATs of bodybuilding. And I asked him, what's the biggest mistake people make? And he said, not doing cardio. And he was talking about like the amount, and we've connected offline as well. And he's just shared how much cardio it takes like to actually build this amazing physique. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, because that's one of the things he brought up was just people don't do enough cardio.
And I'm glad that you brought it up, because I always have to give that caveat because we don't have data. But for somebody like him to say that, who was at the peak of the profession for years, I used to follow bodybuilding. I haven't followed it as much lately. So for him to say that, that's good. I mean, we call that anecdotal advice, but that supports what the research says.
Yeah, and I think also success leaves clues, right? And for him to say that, him seeing it now in what he's seen and him being involved in the sport still, like from a higher level, I just think it's really important to say, and outside of that, like cardio has all kinds of like health benefits for longevity, right? That people tend to overlook. Getting back to like the theme of the conversation, when speaking of fat loss, I think that resistance training has been kind of propped up lately because of your ability to have better body composition for you to burn fat later, all these things. What have you seen in the actual research on fat loss to be like the best approach from an exercise standpoint?
So I'll answer this under 2 different paradigms. If somebody came to me and said, I want to lose as much fat as I can over the next month, my answer would be, then do as much cardio as you can over the next month, because cardio is going to burn a lot more fat than resistance training. I think many times people in their minds, they say, I want to lose fat, but what they're seeing in their mind is a chiseled or a physique that is muscular with lower levels of body fat. And that is a body that's built through resistance training. So I always want to clarify that. If somebody said, hey, I'll pay you $1,000 for every pound of fat I lose in the next week, I'm going to run and walk as much as I possibly can, because that is continuous. Resistance exercise is intermittent. Exercise a little, but if I want a lean looking body, resistance exercise will burn fat, but it also builds muscle. So that's probably, I assume that a lot of people actually, they want a specific look, and that look is achieved more through resistance training than cardio. But as a fat loss researcher, cardio will burn more fat than resistance exercise, calorie for calorie, or minute for minute. That's probably a better way to phrase it.
So follow-up question on that is, how can people program their cardio in their strength sessions? So you'll know, like, this is like bro science, I guess, but it used to be like there was two two frames of thought. One was fasted cardio because you're like in a fasted state and you're just burning fat. And I know that's kind of been debunked, at least from what I've seen over the last few years. Or it was like do cardio after you lift because you've depleted like your muscles and now you're just burning fat. I mean, there was all these theories, I guess, right, around when to do cardio. Like, what's the best way to implement it into a resistance training program?
I would ask the person who's curious about this, what's your primary goal? If they say, I want to get stronger, or I want to have a leaner physique, I want to build muscle, or if they say, hey, I want to be better conditions. But if their goal is anything related to muscle, then I would prioritize the muscle part of my fitness program first. So resistance training. In a perfect, let's say you have fears. So we'll start with that. Because I'll say the research really doesn't, in terms of muscle hypertrophy, it really doesn't matter much. But it makes sense that you do prioritize resistance exercise first, and then you would do cardio second. If you're also going to bring into this, well, I also want to get strong. So then now we're going to factor that in. In a perfect world, then you would do your cardio on a day that you're not resistance training. So you would separate them as much as possible. Now, let's say you can't separate them. You've got to do both in the same day. Well, if you're worried, try to separate them by 6 hours or a minimum of 2 hours if you're worried. If you can't do that and you have to do them back to back, resistance training first, followed by aerobic or your cardio exercise. That's we didn't get it published yet. It could be accepted any day now, but we did a meta-analysis comparing cardio alone, resistance training alone, and then combining them on fat loss. So this has never been done before, at least in with a fat loss approach in a generally young, healthy population. So a lot of my opinions were based on this year of work where we read every single study we could on concurrent training. And by default, we looked at cardio alone, resistance training alone, and then adding them together. And it was pretty eye-opening. It made me realize that cardio, again, didn't really detract from muscle hypertrophy gains from the resistance training. And cardio did, however, cause a little more fat loss. Concurrent training built just as much muscle, but you did lose more fat.
Yeah, one of the things Phil was telling me is he said, think about like when you're doing like the stair stepper and stuff, like cardio, you're meant to like, it's meant to help build muscle. So he was just talking about like thinking about how when you approach like even getting on the stair stepper and how your posture is and how your leg movement and even doing like an incline treadmill walk, like you still should be like trying to work your muscles because the goal is also to build some muscle. So I'm really glad again you like reflected, what he said.
I'll tell you something that's crazy to me, even though I have the spreadsheet to prove it. But if you look at sedentary people who just do cardio, like they start cardio, it's anabolic. Like it is an anabolic stimulus to them. So they actually lose fat and build muscle. And where this became very evident to me was when I did research comparing dieting alone to exercise alone. Dieting alone caused more more weight loss, but dieting caused more lean mass loss. So let's just say, I'll just give some general examples. And this is great. Like literally, if you start somebody who's sedentary, if you're a coach and you're working with a new client, if you get them to do cardio, they'll lose fat and gain muscle. It's all over the research and it's obvious when you look at the studies that compare dieting versus exercise, and exercise being cardio. So when the subjects would diet, we'll just say that they lost 4 pounds of weight. Well, they lost 2 pounds of fat and 2 pounds of lean mass. And when they didn't diet and they said, hey, we want you to use exercise for your or cardio for your weight loss program, they would only lose, let's say, 2 pounds. They would lose 3 pounds of fat and gain 1 pound of muscle. And people would look at that and say, oh, well, they only lost 2 pounds and dieting was 4 pounds. This is where people get the false impression that dieting is better than exercise for weight loss. Well, it is better for weight loss, but there's no acknowledgement of the composition of the weight that is lost. And when you actually look at those studies, cardio alone will burn more fat and actually cause muscle gain in a previously sedentary population.
So what's the equivalent of training until failure, near failure for cardio? Like what does the heart rate have to be, et cetera, for it actually to work?
Whew. Oh, that's a good question. So when I try to equate that, and I've never been asked that question, which is a good question. I just look at it as high intensity or sprint interval training, where you're going as fast as you can, pretty much until your body says, I cannot keep this up any longer, which is typically, like, if you're thinking of like something called a Wingate test, that's about 30 seconds before you're just done, unless you're a hockey player. I used to test some professional hockey players. They would smoke these tests. It was crazy. But on normal people, they throw up after 30 seconds of doing this. But heart rate would be clearly at maximal heart rate. So 220 minus age, if as a general ballpark, if you're going to failure, so to speak, on a cardio. So running until your heart rate cannot physically pump blood anymore. And if it's sprint interval training, just sprinting until you cannot maintain that speed.
But for fat loss, is it like, I think it was at one point, was it like 50 to 70% of max heart rate? What wasn't there, like, there used to be like zones, if I remember, even, in studying as a trainer, that you've kind of followed for fat loss.
Yeah. Yeah. So historically they would say that would be the fat burning zone. But I don't know if we since learned, but what we know now is it's really a calories game. So it's an energy balance equation. Whatever you do to burn more calories, that is what's going to cause more fat loss. That's, again, I see that it's now. I am doing research in menopausal women. They could be an exception to this. I don't think we want to get into that. But anybody other than a woman that's not having these large hormonal fluctuations, whatever the exercise is, whether it's a fat burning zone, if that's causing you to burn more calories, or you're doing high intensity training and that's causing you to burn more calories, whatever is causing the greater negative energy balance, that is going to dictate the amount of the fat loss.
So imagine you have a person, somebody comes to you and they're like, Bill, Dr. Campbell, I want to build muscle, lose fat. If you essentially could create a plan, they automatically would follow it, just like AI driven. What types of foods would you have them eat? How would you set up their day to make sure that they are on track to hit their goal?
Well, one thing I would hope is that they're coming to me not eating much protein, because then my job became easy. If they are eating suboptimal protein and all I do is increase their protein, they will likely gain fat, or they will likely gain muscle and lose fat just from that change alone. And that's hard to believe because, well, they're not training. How can increasing protein? Well, it happens. I can cite the studies. So if they are already eating adequate protein, I would say, okay, well, let's increase it up to 1 gram per pound if you're not currently there. I don't think that that's adding much in terms of muscle gain, but I think that would help with fat loss. So I would increase protein if they're not already at 1 gram per pound. And in terms of their resistance training, I would make sure that we're hitting each muscle group 2 to 3 times per week on their ideal schedule. And here's the other thing. And again, I wouldn't have said this 5 years ago because I was ignorant. Sleep. Are they getting optimal sleep? If you're not getting optimal sleep, deprivation works against you on every front for your body composition goals. It will hurt your body's ability to build muscle mass, and it will cause you to become fat loss resistant. So if you're one study I talk about a lot, they put 2 groups of subjects on I think it was a 500 calorie deficit diet. One group was sleep deprived, the other one was not. I'm almost positive, I'd have to check, but this was a sleep ward study. The group that was sleep deprived lost like 1/3 of the amount of body fat. They literally were fat loss resistant, and they were on the same diet. They reduced their calories the same amount. So back to your question, making sure that resistance training is optimal in the sense of leaf. So are they optimal load, near failure on every working set, and getting around, moderate volume or a volume that's appropriate for them, making sure protein is optimal, ideally around 1 gram per pound, and making sure they are getting enough sleep. And for most people, that's going to be 7+ hours per night.
I know you've worked closely with Lane Norton. Lane's been on the pod a handful of times, and I know when we've talked about this subject around fat loss, obviously compliance, he says, is the science, and like it doesn't really matter if protein and calories are equated. If you follow a low fat diet, low carb diet, like people tend to see, at least from what he said, the same amount of weight loss. Have you found that to be true in your research as well? Because a lot of people, it's like the first thing they say when they want to lose fat. It's like, oh, I'm just going to go low carb and just that's going to like get rid of things. So like, what is your stance on all that?
Yeah, I agree with Lane 100%. As long as protein is standardized, it does not matter whether you're eating low fat or high fat, low carb, high carb. As long as protein is equal. The one area where low carb diets appear to be better is and you're going to find plenty of studies where low carbs will crush the other diets, but in all of those studies, they also had a higher protein intake. When you look at the low carb studies where protein is standardized, they're no better. They're no worse, but they're also no better. And I'm not anti low carb. A low carb or ketogenic diet is the best diet to suppress hunger. So that's a great diet for people who can stick to it, who really struggle with hunger. So it shines there. Where it lacks is it is not the best diet to maximize muscle gains. It's a little less of an anabolic. It limits your anabolic potential while you're on it. So I'd say if your primary goal is fat loss and you really struggle with hunger, I think a ketogenic low carb diet would be something to consider. But if you told me, hey, I want to build as much muscle as I can, I don't think that would be a good choice.
And is it because the carbohydrates create some sort of anabolic effect?
That's part of it. The other thing is testosterone levels seem to go down with very low carbohydrates. So there's that response as well. I've seen that in 2 different studies. And then we also have insulin is very anabolic. So insulin will suppress muscle protein breakdown. So if you're eliminating insulin, now muscle protein breakdown is somewhat operating without any checks. So there's 2 mechanisms, a loss of testosterone, a lowering of testosterone, and lowering the anti-catabolic effects that insulin would typically have in a normal carbohydrate diet.
I'd love for you to bust a few myths about fat loss and building muscle that you see. Like, what are some things that you have seen either recently or over the years that just drive you absolutely nuts when you see them?
I don't like it when I see people like demonize or praise one food. Name the food. This is the best food ever. If you're going to hail something up as the best thing for fat loss, then say protein. But again, I like olive oil. I don't know if olive oil is magical. I like strawberries. Somebody demonizes strawberries. I had a lady, she stopped eating strawberries because she saw something that somebody said. And I'm just like, don't fear strawberries. Like, if you like strawberries, eat strawberries.
We've lost the plot.
Yeah. Oh, that's so. And it's people that know better that are doing this. Like again, I'm a scientist, and this person was an MD. They have to know better. They are just like, I appreciate you. You have your boundaries, and I'm on social media, and we both know you can say things that would make our lives a lot better, get more algorithm, whatever that is. Man, it's just it's very sad when medical professionals are going into this. It makes me angry. It's like, if that's what you got to do for whatever money you're making, but I don't like it when women. Most of my communications with women, I can't eat strawberries, or why is fruit unhealthy? I'm like, it's not. Like, eat that. It's good for you.
Yeah. It's funny. I've said this, I believe several times on the show. My biggest roadblock with my clients early on in my career was convincing them to start exercising more and to eat healthier, like educating them on why they shouldn't, eat cheeseburgers and hot dogs all the time on the weekends and stuff. Now, over the last few years, my biggest roadblock has been dispelling BS and convincing them not to go on these extreme protocols or to stop like taking a food scanner in a grocery store. It's changed so much. And I think I had Kelly Starrett and his wife on. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, several years ago. And he said the fitness community, it was something like this. He said the fitness community has done a really good job at getting the fitness enthusiasts more fit. We've done a horrible job at getting the average person healthier. And I think that just speaks to kind of what you just spent the last few minutes talking about, is that we've just kind of like lost the plot on what's important for people.
Yep. No, that's a very good introspection. I think that's right. There's probably more confusion today for that population than there was 10 years ago.
100%. Before I let you go, I would love to know, as an exercise scientist, what are your top 5 favorite exercises?
Squat would be my most hated and most loved. I don't know. I hate squat day, but when I'm done, I feel like I'm the king of the world. So it's a love-hate. So squat would be my favorite, but I hate it. And let me just rephrase. The question is just, what are my 5 favorite?
Yeah, like if you had 5 exercises and you can only do those 5 exercises for a period of time, what would you do?
Okay, so squat, I want to say bench press, but I definitely would say deadlift, but again, don't really like doing them, but I do them. I try to do it once a week. I have a deadlift day. Squat, bench, deadlift, dips. I would like to say shoulder presses, but I can't press overhead very well because of a back injury. So there's 4. So dips. I'll go ahead and say chin ups. So they're not in my current routine, so maybe I'm being hypocritical. But squat, bench, deadlift, dips, chin up, because then I'm getting a lot of biceps. So I'm getting my biceps to offset the dips. So, yeah.
Well, Bill, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom, your research, your expertise. I think people are going to get a lot of value out of this conversation, so much so that they're going to want to check out more of what you do. Where's the best place to do that?
Oh, 2 places. And thank you for asking. One is my Instagram, and I do a lot of education on there. It's Bill Campbell, Ph.D. And I have a website that is also billcampbellphd.com. And on my website, I sell a research review, and it's basically where I summarize the latest and best research on building muscle and losing fat. It's solely focused on those 2 things. So what does their latest research say, or some of the best research ever done? And I summarize it. I bring in professional coaches or doctors or physicians, and I say, hey, how would you apply this research to your clients or your patients? So I give the research, they give the application, and I think it's the best thing in the fitness community.
Love it, man. And it's a good resource for people to check out, because I know the theme of our conversation was how to build muscle and lose fat. So Bill, thank you again for your time. Like I said, the audience is going to really love this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me.